Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you. Today we're taking a look at an APUSH video focusing in on topic 5.6, which is entitled The Failure of Compromise. And wow, is that an understatement for a title to depict what's going on in America in the 1850s for sure. Excuse me. So when we get into the 1850s, once again, we are still continuing to see this growing sectionalism, this growing divide on the issue of slavery. Once again, we take slavery from what had been previously this, primarily economic / political issue, the idea that there's different values in the North and the South, and they all each kind of have their own way of doing things and living, and slavery was viewed as that quote-unquote peculiar institution, special institution of the South. And it was mostly a, kind of a mindset of agree to disagree. As we start to get into the 1830s and 40s, though, that is becoming, a much more polarizing issue to the point now where, as we are in the 1850s, that it really has become a moral issue. From the North, more and more Americans are taking up cause with the abolitionists, believing that slavery is immoral, cannot be allowed to exist, and at an absolute minimum, cannot be allowed to be extended west. Whereas in the South, there is this, growing sentiment that slavery is not just needed economically, that it is also morally justifiable, that the Bible supports the use of having slaves. There's this notion that, in the South, there is this patriarchal notion that slave owners take care of slaves as, like family, if you will, as opposed to in the North where blacks are ignored and marginalized and not taken care of. And as we mentioned before, there's this, continued argument of protecting property rights in the form of slavery, that you can't just get rid of slavery arbitrarily because that would violate Fifth Amendment due process rights. So keep in mind, this is continuing to divide America, and note, this is emblematic of really two different Americas that are existing simultaneously at this point. A northern half of the United States that is using free wage labor to become more and more industrialized, more urbanized, more ethnically diverse, with more and more immigrants coming to the north, connected with railroad infrastructure and telegraph lines, and moving in this much more modern direction, whereas south of the Ohio River, south of the Mason-Dixon line, you have this slave-based economy, heavily invested in cotton, and has held on tenaciously to its traditional way of life, a rural, agricultural, plantation-centered life, with rivers being the primary mode of transportation as opposed to railroads, lack of diversity ethnically, little immigration. And so you really have, excuse me, two different Americas existing simultaneously. And as we, continue through the 1850s, there's this growing sense that these two separate Americas can't really survive simultaneously. And of course, that's what the Civil War is going to, lead to, prove. But that being said, though, that's not to say that there will not be numerous attempts in the 1850s to try to find a middle ground, to try to make this marriage between the North and the South still work, even though you're really talking about two different Americas at the same time. Which then leads us into the election of 1852. Now, when we get into talking about the election of 1852, there have been some major changes that have been taking place in the Whig Party as of late. And that included the death of key leaders like Henry Clay. Yes, Henry Clay has finally passed on. And Daniel Webster. You've seen John C. Calhoun pass away. So a lot of the old guard politically that had a tradition of trying to keep the Union together through deal making, especially like a Henry Clay type, those folks are no longer around anymore. And this younger generation, as we mentioned before, people like William Seward, are going to be more along the lines of showing a willingness to take a side on slavery for moral reasons, and thereby kind of, staking their claim in terms of a willingness to alienate half of America. So what does that then leave us in terms of presidential candidates? Well, what it leaves us is this diminishing number of politicians nationally that are not going to be willing to take a stance on slavery one way or the other. And what this shows is a really, really noticeable lack of leadership that's going to be emerging in the candidates and the actual presidents of the 1850s, because anybody that really did have a spine on the issue of slavery, they were seen as, for the most part, politically radioactive, that the major parties would not nominate them out of a sense of, well, if you nominate somebody that's like a William Seward who's an abolitionist, that you're not going to get a southern state, period, end of story. Therefore, you're probably not going to win. So you get these kind of wishy-washy, somewhat spineless presidents of the 1850s. And looking at the 1852 president election, you've got Franklin Pierce, the Democrat. Now, he is a northerner from New Hampshire, a veteran of the Mexican War, but he has not taken a stance, clearly on the issue of slavery. And so he is still kind of that old mindset that, no, he doesn't own slaves. No, he wouldn't own slaves, but he's not going to take away the rights of somebody else to own a slave. You've also got on the Whig side, now with Henry Clay now gone and Zachary Taylor having died previously, and Millard Fillmore now kind of associated with this Compromise of 1850 that is not very popular nationally. The Whigs go back to the well once again and try to use a tried and true formula to win, and that's finding a well-known, famous war hero, and that's going to come in the form of old fuss and feathers himself, Winfield Scott. Once again, another character that does not take a firm stance on the issue of slavery. Now, once again, with the major parties being too scared to take a stance on slavery, it leaves room for the Free Soil Abolitionist Party. But once again, the Free Soilers, like the Liberty Party before them, they're going to be a pretty marginalized group politically. So it is going to come down to the Democrats and the Whigs. And in this election, it's not really going to be close. You're going to see here that Pierce is going to throw a beating on old fuss and feathers. As you can see here, Scott only picks up 4 states. So it's a massive win for Franklin Pierce and the Democrats. And this is going to be important because this will be the last Whig candidate for President of the United States. Due to the deaths of old stalwart leaders like Clay and Webster and the growing divide nationally on slavery, the Whig Party is basically going to dissolve after this election. The northern halves and the southern halves are now focused more on the issue of slavery than trying to find a national consensus. So the Whig Party, due to lack of leadership and the slavery issue, just devolves. Now, note, this is not going to lead us into a second era of good feeling, but it will lead to a very quick reformulation of northern former Whigs into this new party called the Republicans. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, to round out what we're talking about today, we're going to take a look at, maybe the most controversial piece of legislation of the 1850s, even more controversial perhaps than the Compromise of 1850, and that is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act gets its start through the desire of Stephen Douglas, this up-and-coming senator from Illinois, to get a transcontinental railroad line produced. Now, I know that we've mentioned previously that the Gadsden Purchase in what is going to be, southern Arizona was purchased for the purpose of creating a national railroad line. But Douglas, coming from Illinois, wants to have the line start in Chicago and move out to San Francisco. And if that were the case, that would take a more northerly route. So that then brings the question of, okay, if we do build a transcontinental railroad along a northern route, what are we going to do? And note, as I try to fix this a little bit here, if we're going to build the train through this more northerly route, what's then going to be happening with regards to issues of slavery and all that kind of stuff? Because this was, at the time, unorganized territory. And so once again, it kind of leads to this question of, hey, what's going to be the fate of slavery? Now, granted, we had already had the 1820 Missouri Compromise on the books that already gave us, some sense of what to do. But note, Douglas can't get the railroad bill through Congress unless there is a approval from the South, and the South's not letting this go on. If it's going to be north of the 3630 line, there's going to be a ban on slavery. So what you then see as a concern is, okay, what can we do legislatively to make this deal work to get the railroad line through? And this is where Stephen Douglas is going to adopt the old Lewis Cass ideal of popular sovereignty. And so to get the railroad bill through, basically Douglas crafts a deal. And note, Douglas is trying to kind of, frame himself as the new Henry Clay, the new great deal maker. He's from a western state, at least a somewhat western state of that time, Illinois. The idea being is that folks out to the west are much more in support of this idea of popular sovereignty. Let the people of a given territory decide for themselves, and that popular sovereignty might be the middle ground that we can use to kind of keep this union together by letting democracy decide for itself. So it's presented as a very reasonable solution to a very polarizing topic. And it is able to get passed through Congress. And so to make this happen, the old 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise is repealed. This is now going to be gone. And what will then be created from this unorganized territory is the Nebraska Territory to the north and the Kansas Territory to the south. Each now opened up to popular sovereignty, meaning that the residents of these territories will now be the ones that will ultimately decide the fate of slavery into these territories moving westward. Now, it's presented as the idea of, well, if folks don't want slavery, then there'll be more Northerners that'll show up and they'll vote against slavery. And if more people want to have slavery, they'll see more Southerners move there and it'll be open to slavery. But this is going to be a disaster of a policy move. And if you haven't figured this out yet, basically saying, hey, whoever shows up to come vote is going to determine the fate of slavery into the West. Well, guess what? You've now pretty much sent out a personalized invitation to the most radical of abolitionists and the most ardent of fire-eating, defenders of slavery to pretty much, hey, let's come together to these new territories and let's, get together and literally have a vote on this issue. The people that are the least willing to compromise, that are least reasonable on the issue, are now going to be brought together. As you can see here, this is a bad, bad idea. But in the name of getting a railroad line through, that is what's going to be happening. So anyhow, as we're kind of foreshadowing here, things are not going to be looking good, especially when we get to Kansas here very, very soon. So we'll leave it here for now. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.